I just want to welcome you to our webinar on working with communities to change social norms, experience from Girls Not Bride's member. My name is Alessandra Tranquilli, and I work within the learning team at Girls Not Bride Secretariat based in London. Girls Not Bride is a partnership of over 900 civil society organizations working across over 95 countries. At least 70% of our members identify as community-based organizations, and many of them are struggling with the questions of what works to change social norms around child marriage. Our role as a learning team is to facilitate learnings between members about what it will take to end child marriage and to help connect our members to initiatives that help strengthen their work. So we asked some of our members via a survey to tell us what would be most useful to them so that we could help provide that. We also launched our learning series last month, and this is our third webinar. The first one in January was focused on what we know from evidence is needed to address child marriage. And the second one, which took place last week, explored what we know specifically about community engagement, social norms, and child marriage. Next slides, please. The main messages which came out from our previous webinars is that there is no single solutions or silver bullets, and that integrated strategies are needed to address child marriage. During last week's webinar, we heard from Caroline Harper from ODI and Anjali Kohli from the Georgetown University Institute of Reproductive Health. Both of them reinforced the need for multi-level, multi-components intervention, but they both also stress the importance of working for and with communities when it comes to addressing social norms related to child marriage. So, as a partnership, one of our strategic goals is to make sure that effort to engage families, communities, and girls are supported and highlighted. With this webinar, we hope to complement some of the discussion that we had last week about evidence from academic research with some practical examples. So we wanted to understand what does it take to implement participatory and community-led programs aimed at addressing social norms. So that's why we decided to showcase two approaches for engaging communities around social norms, and most importantly, to share the challenges that both these organizations have faced and the coping mechanism that they've developed as a result. We hope it will give you a good understanding of what is at stake when implementing intervention aimed at social norms. We hope it will stimulate some good discussions and help shape some of the conversation we want to have at our upcoming global meeting in June. Next slide, please. So with this webinar, we're trying a bit of a different approach. This is the last slide that you will see. Afterwards, I wanted to interview two speakers. One of them is Molly Melching, which is the founder and creative director of Tostan, and Suraya from Jashish, a community-based organization which is implementing the Tipping Point initiative in Bangladesh in partnership with CARE. So I will interview both of them and then open the floor for online participants to ask their questions too. So if you think of any questions while you listen to the interviews, feel free to write them down in the chat box and we will address them after both interviews. At the end, we'll also hear from Susan Petroning, who's an expert on gender norms, and Nidal Karim, who's the Tipping Point Initiative Project Director. So we'll hear a bit about them to hear their main takeaways before closing the discussions. So without further ado, let me start with an interview with Molly. So Molly, thank you very much for your time and availability to be with us today. Can you tell us why did you decide to start using social norm theory in your work? Hold on, we're trying to find Molly.
Oh, hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Well, you have to unmute me.
Yeah,
I was muted.
Trying. Okay, so sorry, the floor is yours. Why did you decide to start using social norms theory in your work?
Thank you so much, and hello to everyone who's listening. We at Tostan actually did never sit down and decide to use social norm theory. Actually, it was because we were implementing our 3-year basic education program, which is always in national languages, in many villages in Senegal and in other African countries. And from our work when we introduced human rights and health information into our module, we had a reaction from one of the villages who was going through the program, who they decided on their own to stand up and end some harmful traditional practices, such as female genital cutting and child marriage. And when they did that, after learning their human rights and learning the health consequences of the practices, they had much resistance. And it was then that another villager, an imam and a village chief, came to Tostan and told us that he had been through the program himself. And he understood that these were harmful practices now, but that this was not the way to end practices such as female genital cutting and child marriage, which are very accepted and almost expected in many cases. And there are sanctions. For example, with female genital cutting, if you don't do it, you are heavily sanctioned. In the same way that if sometimes a girl is not married at an early age, the family may be sanctioned for not having married her when she's young. And so these two practices carry great social value. He told us that the way to approach this and the strategy to use is to not have people stand up alone, but rather to ask those who have decided within the classroom, who've learned about this, who are like a core group, to reach out to their extended family, to those people who matter to them, whose opinion matters to them, and who will be sanctioned otherwise if they do something different. So this is what we did, and it turns out that what Demba was telling us was really what we call social norm theory today. It was later confirmed by academics, in that it is a practice where there are expectations from the reference group, the people who matter to one another. There are sanctions, both positive and negative, involved. Positive when you do it, negative when you don't do it, and they carry social value. And again, I say Demba was the first to introduce us to that, and he has guided us all through in the future. He guided us through our programs, helping to support us in the work we continue to do in other villages.
So you kind of touched upon my next question already, but what are the main strategies that you've adopted to initiate social norm changes, and how did you involve community in formulating your strategies and designing your program? So you talked a lot about Demba and his influence in the way you work. How are you, beyond Demba, do you involve communities in formulating your strategies and designing your programs?
Right, and that is totally different, because as we went to more and more communities, what we realized is that the main thing we need to do, what is most important, is to give people good information and non-judgmental information. And so we always start with what we call the core group, and that is the classroom. People go to class at Tostan for 3 years. It's a long time, but they also learn many other things. It's a holistic program. It's not just focused on ending female genital cutting or child marriage. People learn human rights, democracy. They learn problem solving, hygiene, health, literacy, and project management. So it's really it touches on all aspects of their life, not just this one aspect. And that is very important. And as people learn in the classroom, they come to a consensus that these practices really are not in line with their deeper values of health and well-being. And that if they want to have a community where there is good health in the future and where their children will have a better future, that they need to re-examine some of the practices that they have carried out for so many years. And so you start with the core group, and then they start by reaching out to the village chief, the imam, or the religious leader, it's a different religion, and they then get their approval and their buy-in, and afterwards go to the community. They do sessions, and again, our program is very participatory. We use participatory methods that engage people in dialogue, discussion. We do plays, songs, poetry, and they reach out to the community and get buy-in from the community, and the community comes to consensus about the importance of abandoning practices that can harm girls particularly. And after that, we help to facilitate the community members who are very passionate about these issues, because they do become very passionate about it as they learn more and more in the program. And they reach out to what we call the reference group, or the people who matter in other communities. They go and have discussions with them and dialogue and explain their experiences and why they have decided to abandon, and invite them to be part of a movement. And then as the movement grows, we help them facilitate inter-village meetings. And sometimes those end in public declarations where they all come together as a united family. It's very positive, it's joyful. People come together not to blame and shame, but rather to say, we have decided for health and well-being, and we are ending practices which do not lead to that. We now know that, we learned it, and this is why we are deciding together as a united family to abandon it.
Oh, great.
And so therefore the social norm will no longer be sanctioned. If, for example, if they do not practice, they will not be sanctioned. This is what is so critical.
Thanks. And what are three of the main challenges that you encounter when you implement your programs? And what strategies have you developed, as a result? What are the three main kind of resistance that you found?
Well, as you can well imagine, we did have religious opposition in the beginning, and some opposition from men when we started our program. And we, because of that, understood that they did not feel included and they did not really understand what this program was about. So we have started doing religious leader trainings, and they started with just a day training, and then we realized how important they were. And actually, we are now doing 10-day trainings for religious leaders so that they really understand what the community is going to learn and why it is so important that they be at the forefront of this movement to end harmful practices, because it is not aligned with their religious values. And so that is one of the main solutions we found. The other is that donors often are searching for quick fixes. They would like us to have a program that will reach results in 4 months or a year at the most. But our program is 3 years long, and we believe that these people who have never been to school, who have not had an opportunity for education, they deserve to have a good education in their own language. And so we work with donors who believe the same thing, that education is a human right, and it's the responsibility of us to help, and they also participate in taking care of the facilitator and providing a classroom. So that has been really critical also, but it's been a difficulty for us because you can't always find donors who will fund 3 years. And then the third thing I would say, the challenge is that it's important to insist on this holistic approach and not just go in and work on child marriage. Then people feel like, if you're just coming to work on child marriage, that you come in with your own agenda. You're not really listening to people and what their priorities are, what their goals are, and what they want to learn and be helped with, supported with in achieving their goals. So I think it's really, really important to first listen to people and make sure that you're addressing all of their priorities and not just imposing your agenda when you go into a community. So sometimes people do not understand how important and how critical that is.
Thanks, thanks, Molly. Just in the interest of time, if that's okay with you, I know we have another questions on top three recommendation, but I would like to hear from Suraya now, and then we'll in the Q&A session we'll come back to those recommendations, if that's okay. So, Suraya, I know you're on Skype with us. Can you hear us well?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Great. Thanks for joining us, Suraya. We've got the similar set of questions for you working in Bangladesh on the Tipping Point Initiative. So why did you decide to tackle social norm change in your work?
Yeah, thank you. We carried out a community participatory analysis, CPS. You may call it baseline study. In our study, we found that most people in the community knew about the harmful consequences of child marriage, like maternal or child health related issues. So it was clear that only knowledge or awareness building program was not enough for them to prevent the practice. And that's why we wanted to look at social norms for being behavioral transformation in community people. Additionally, most of the community members think poverty and the lack of access to school are the only causes of child marriage. But our experience says that even economically solvent families are also practice child marriage, and often girls who are attending school or are pulled out getting married. So we realized that not only economical factor or infrastructural factor are the main causes of child marriage, but non-curable factors are the main reason. Here we saw that simply addressing the immediate causes like poverty and school access is not be able to bring about sustainable changes. So our project wanted to make sustainable changes by eliminating the root causes of child marriage. And we could see that local community expect that girls can play outside and they will be married off at a certain age. Those are really restricting girls' mobility and freedom. And we want to change those expectations, especially for girls are valid for. So that's why we choose social work approach.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I'm just going to recap a bit of what you said because I think the connection is still quite bad and some participants are having trouble understanding you. So just to recap, I think you said one of the reasons you've decided to engage in social norm is because when you did your community participatory analysis, you realized that only knowledge or awareness being building programs were not enough, so you decided to dig deeper and go into social norms work. You also said that you saw that simply addressing the immediate perceived cause like poverty or school access would not be able to bring about sustainable change, and you decided that in order to address the root causes, you would need to work on social norms. And ultimately, you also said that you could see that the greater community expect that girls cannot, play outside, or certain values are imposed on girls, which limits their values. So that's again one of the reasons why social norms approach was chosen. The next question is, what are the main strategies you have adopted to initiate social norm change?
When we at first we identify some early adopters in the community. Early adopters mean people who are already doing the positive practice.
Suraya,
We facilitated the process of sharing their knowledge, journey and experience with other community
Suraya, can I interrupt you?
So it's an innovative activity.
Suraya?
And secondly, we also provided support for the early adopters.
Sorry, I need to interrupt you because I think that the sound is quite bad. Would we mind if Nidal could jump in just to get a bit of a better sound? I'm so sorry. People are saying they can't hear you very well. Nidal, are you okay with jumping in? Nidal?
Hi, Alessandra. Yes, sure, I can jump in on behalf of Soraya. Sorry, Soraya, that the sound is not working, but I'll refer to what she has shared in the past and build on that. Can people hear me better, or is my sound okay?
Yes, your sound is fine.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alessandra. Yeah, so in terms of the strategies, I think what Soraya was starting with is this idea of with finding the early adopters. So really looking at who are the people in the community who are already kind of practicing more gender equitable behaviors or more supportive of girls, and identifying them and creating space for them to come together to share their thoughts and be able to be change makers in solidarity with others, because often it's hard to do that on your own if you're going against an established norm. Firstly, it's identifying the early adopters, then also providing support to them, so creating groups. So in Bangladesh, the teams created these forums called End Violence Against Women forums, which were where they're called EBA forums, and mothers groups. And these were safe spaces where there were people who are early adopters as well as some who are not, but it created space for discussion and dialogue and for early adopters to be able to kind of talk about what they believed and where they felt like the existing community norms maybe were not aligning with their values without facing sanctions and stigma in that safe space. And then the third thing would be really focusing on sharing out a vision for positive alternatives. So as Soraya mentioned, very early on, we saw from our findings that most people knew about the harms of child marriage. So, just raising knowledge about that or talking about the harmful effects was not the direction, but kind of taking the social norms kind of a theoretical approach and focusing on building an image of the positive alternative. So people can imagine how it could look like if they choose to invest in girls, if girls have more mobility, if girls have more equitable roles in their families, and illustrating those messages in public ways.
Okay.
I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. And so how did you involve communities in formulating your strategy and designing your programs within the Tipping Point initiative?
So one of the nice things in our first phase was that we really were trying to explore and innovate, and this gave us the opportunity to open up space for ideas. So for a lot of the girl-specific activities, these were ideas that the girls came up with themselves. So for example, they said, well, we want to play football, we want to ride bicycles, we want to race boats, all things that were not acceptable or available to them in their communities. And then we worked with them and the adult groups and community leaders to create that environment where these activities could become possible. The other thing also was we worked at looking at innovations that were coming from our core staff, that is at the community level. So at the community level, the program has community volunteers and community facilitators, and while they're program staff, they're also residents of those specific communities and villages, and so they also played a big role in kind of coming up with the ideas of different innovative activities that they wanted to do using social norms programming principles. We have these social norms innovation briefs that are available on the GNB website, on the Tipping Point website, but you can see particular examples of activities that we've tried to highlight in those briefs that came up from ideas that came from our community members and from the girls.
Great. Yeah, thanks. And what are the three main challenges that you have encountered while implementing the project, and what strategies you have developed to address them, and why?
Sure. So not, very similar to what Molly shared. engaging men and boys was harder, especially because using our typical tactics, we weren't able to get to them, or they wouldn't come to the groups or the spaces. So the teams really had to think about, well, how do we go to them? Because it's harder to get men to come to groups. And one of the things that they came up with was tea stall meetings. In a lot of, in pretty much all communities and villages in Bangladesh, the tea stall is an organic convening space for men. And so the teams decided to go into tea stalls and have dialogues and facilitate conversations within the tea stalls. Another main thing that came up, and again, similar to what Molly said, religious leaders often can be an obstacle. But what we found is even within that, there's always a few supportive religious leaders. And so kind of similar to that idea of finding early adopters, we tried to really find the supportive religious leaders, seek their support, and work with them to then have them work with their peers who were standing up in opposition. And finally, one of the things that, I wouldn't say we've come up with the solution for, but, we're continuing to try to get to is, we see this issue around the fear and control of girls' sexuality as a core root cause for child marriage. And we've tried to bring in discussions and conversations around sexuality, but in a lot of our communities, this is not easy conversations to have, and often it's even hard, for our teams to have these conversations. So we started on that journey and really started from a space of starting with what feels safer and easier to talk about, which is around sexual reproductive health and rights, before we feel like we will be able to get to a space where we can have conversations about the more kind of critical piece that is about the control of girls' sexuality.
Okay. And based on those challenges that you mentioned, imagine if you were a community-based organization about to start a programming on social norms and child marriage. What would be your top 3 recommendations to them?
So I think number one is critical to find positive examples within the community, and going from that. So, and I think, again, this resonates so much with what Molly said, which is it's not about coming in and imposing from an outsider, but really seeing who are the people within the community who already have these thoughts or are practicing maybe in private or want to but are afraid to, and identifying them and kind of using their energy and their championness to move an agenda forward. I think the other thing, which I mentioned earlier too, is this idea of using positive and future-oriented messages. I think for us, it's been really a learning to see how when communities can see a different image, can almost giving them the visions of what that can look like, and a good example is, once the girls started playing football, there was resistance, but also there was this acknowledgement of like, wow, we didn't think they could do that, or actually this is really great, or this is there are these capacities they have that we had not thought about, and that that kind of positive future-oriented message works much better than using punitive approaches, which are, trying to scare people or threatening them with the law or legal mechanisms. And then lastly, I think, again, resonating with Molly, just and I think what you've mentioned, came up from even the evidence reviews, is the importance of having multi-layer programming and targeting different groups. So it's not just about the girls, that we're working with parents, we're working with community members, influential individuals from the community, and that the social norms programming is really embedded within like a much more holistic set of programming, and isn't some sort of standalone, or like, as you mentioned, there is no silver bullet, but it is a complementary approach that can be used with a broader set of holistic programming.
Great, thanks very much. If that's okay with you, I would like to also hear from Molly around, you know, her top 3 recommendations for let's say any community-based organization on doing social norms programming, and then I will open the floor for questions from the audience. Molly, what would be your main recommendation? Yeah.
Sure. My first recommendation is always the education, and if possible, to do an education program that is not just a year, but actually that is for women and girls, particularly, and men who have never been to school. And so we do 3 years and sometimes 4. And that's an empowering education. It's not just any education. It's one that introduces human rights and responsibilities. And it allows youth and adults, men and women, and elders, religious leaders to really come together in a dialogue. The whole first year of our program is about dialogue and community conversation and addressing all these issues so that people can, for the first time, come together and discuss subjects they've never discussed before. And all that starts, and this is the second recommendation, is similar to what Soraya's methods have been, is that you start where people are, and you start with what is their vision and what are their values, what does their future look like, and where do they want to be in the future, and how can we as an organization help to support them for the goals that they have. And so again, it's bringing them together around a consensus of what that would be, and then doing what we call values deliberation, looking at things that they're doing already and that correspond or are aligned with their values, and those that may not. And that has been really critical in our program for people deciding together as a family, and then as they reach out to the rest of the community, of that core group reaches out to the rest of the community, and then to many other communities that are part of their social network, then you have them deciding on abandoning practices in a way that does not tear apart the fabric of African society, where unity and the family are so important, and those are essential values. So that is really, really important. And then spending the time, again, I will go back to the time element. It doesn't happen overnight, social change, and we know that. And I think everyone who listens and who's listening now knows that these things take time. So you have to be patient and perseverant, and you have to be careful, again, very good listeners, and really be flexible, and follow what the people say is the right way to go, and make sure that they feel like you're respecting them and that you're not judgmental. We always say the worst thing you can do when there is a social norm in place is to give messages, say, stop this, or don't do that, or this is bad, or put up signs and say, you know, this is awful, barbaric, whatever. That is not the way to approach a social norm, because a social norm means that people believe that what they're doing has social value. And so they will just become very defensive. And so we believe that the only way to really to address social norms is through basic education, which is empowering, which allows for the dialogue. A lot of the things that Soraya said also, we agree with a lot of what she's doing, and building critical mass. It doesn't happen overnight. We don't talk about a tipping point really, because we don't know when that would ever happen. But we do talk about the important thing being getting a critical mass of people who believe it is time to change this practice, coming together. The public declaration is critical because it allows people to be on radio, to be on TV, and to explain themselves, not toast on, but the participants themselves get up and explain that these practices are harmful. And for the first time, they discussed them and found out that many of their girls have suffered. Many of the women have had problems. They've never discussed this before. And this allows for people on the outside to hear this and decide to make changes within their communities also. So using the media also in that way, when it's the people themselves expressing themselves, is also very critical.
Okay. And one question that that we have is, so, for example, Nidal talked about, how fear of girl sexuality and a desire to control girl sexuality can be a drivers for child marriage in the communities they work in. So we were just curious to see, how does Tustin has addressed fear of girl sexuality? How do you, what did you find that works and doesn't work to talk around girl sexuality, if you found anything that works around that?
Well, a part of our program is sexual and reproductive health. And we found out that many girls didn't really know how to get pregnant. And we have to approach the issue and the subject very carefully. And what we do is, when we go into a community, we make sure that the village chief and the imam and the women, the elders, that they are all aware of the subjects that we are going to be discussing. And really, sometimes if the villagers do not agree, we do not come to that village. But usually we go to villages on invitation, because people have understood the benefits from the program. But we tell them the reason we're doing this education is because a lot of times the things they fear most, girls' pregnancy, and becoming sexually active before they're married, are related to the fact that they don't understand their bodies, how you get pregnant, and how you can avoid unwanted pregnancies. This is really critical, that we say that this is the way that you are going to work on these issues that you so fear, more than trying to marry your daughter to someone. And again, it's values deliberation, where they talk about how much they want their daughters to go to school and succeed and have jobs, and we discuss that in relation to what will happen to them if they do get married, and we discuss child pregnancy. One of the things that worked very well was doing a lot of work on fistula, and them understanding that when a girl is not fully developed and her pelvis is too small, that she is great risk of getting fistula, and that has been the cause of much suffering. And there are people in our communities that can testify to that. So all of that has helped us to get people to realizing that there are other ways of preventing unwanted pregnancies before marriage, which is so important for them.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for this. A question that I had for you was around, so one of the arguments for having a very multi-pronged approach, and because sometimes one of the argument is like, well, if you work on social norms, it's great you change social norm, but if you don't change all the other aspects around, if you don't improve access to jobs or education, you risk raising the community's expectation, and then if they don't, if there's no other solution for the girls afterwards, then I just wanted to see how do you deal with that in your programmings? I don't.
You're talking to me, right? Are you talking to me?
I'm going to ask Molly, and then I'm going to ask Nidal to answer that one too. So yeah, Molly, the floor is yours.
That is why literacy and income generation are such an important part of our program, because we teach in the program how to do a feasibility study, how to do a budget. We work and give microcredit funds, or what we call the community development funds, to the participants. They start with a savings, and after they have saved for a year, then we do add to that about $800, which they just take off, because they have practice in doing that with their own savings, and they start realizing that they can you do income generating activities, which gives them more more income and that there are other alternatives. But we do believe that that's really important. This is why we keep saying that a holistic approach is so important, because we emphasize governance. We've had hundreds of women who have been elected. Why? Because they know human rights and responsibilities, and they have confidence, because in class we do a lot of rehearsal so that the women can learn to speak out. And you know, that takes time, but it's so critical, because then when they're leaders, when they're elected to the municipal council, they can advocate for their rights, they can advocate for more health, more education, and more emphasis put on girls' education and work for youth. So it's so important to have these women being elected. And so, again, governance, economic empowerment, the environment, health, and education, those are all areas that I think need to be addressed in what we call sort of an alternative education program, a non-formal education program that really prepares people to be able to achieve their own priorities and also make important changes in their lives for better well-being.
Thanks. Nidal, would you like to give us your opinion on that one as well? As in, so how do you ensure in your programs that you don't just, you know, raise the community's expectation, but then not being able to follow through afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, very much resonating with what Molly has shared, the piece around governance and how holistic, you know, for us, the holistic programming is about adolescents being able to speak up for their rights, to advocate for their rights with their duty bearers, with their community leaders, and as well as, you know, other adult champions in the community. In Bangladesh, in our first phase, we didn't, you know, delve as much into the livelihoods portion, other than trying to really connect people with what government services exist, kind of creating awareness around where those resources are, and working with them to hold their duty bearers accountable to their communities to provide the services that they have rights to. In our second phase, we're exploring this idea of an income generating or savings group aspect. So that's something that we're going to be looking at more closely in this second phase. And it goes back again to this specific question that you've raised, which is, you know, changing the norms, but then, you know, what are the other structures or systems that need to be in place for girls to be able to step into and actually have true alternatives. And so some of that is tapping into the existing ones and tapping into what is there, and having the existing structures provided. But also, as Molly mentioned, you know, they're doing microcredit. We're really trying to think about what are some ways in which, as an organization, we can perhaps try some things that creates more transformative avenues for career paths for girls, beyond the typical things which are usually sewing or you know, chicken raising. We're trying to think about what are some gender transformative avenues that we can also facilitate.
Thanks. We've got another question, which is about, you know, how do you evaluate social norm change in your programs? How do you demonstrate impact, given that, as we said, you know, sometimes it's quite hard to implement long-term programs. So, you know, as we know, social norms take change to happen, and most donors sometimes are shy of funding more than 2-3 years programs. So how do you demonstrate impact and evaluate your programs? Let's ask this question to Molly first, and then we'll hear from Nidal.
Okay, I think it's a very important question, and it's one that we have really struggled with over the years, because when you're talking about issues like female genital cutting and child marriage, they are often very sensitive subjects. So when you go into a community, you usually do a baseline. And when you start asking questions about child marriage and female genital cutting, then people get kind of nervous and they say, is this what this program is about? I don't know whether we want to do this. Are they going to come tell us to stop? And so we struggled with that a lot. But we do a baseline. And what we've tried to do is not ask really invasive questions around these issues, but we do, from a social norms perspective now, we try to figure out what the rest of the community is doing, because we know that if you ask a person, what would the rest of the community say if you were to marry your daughter at 13 or 14 years old? And if they say that, we say, would everybody approve? Would they disapprove? Would over half approve? Would over half disapprove? And the answers to that question, when they answer that question, we know that if the rest of the community approves, they probably are practicing also. Even if they say themselves, no, I don't do that. I wouldn't do that. But if they say that the others would approve of it, we know they probably are doing it too. Same thing with female genital cutting, that they would also then be probably held in, that tradition would be held into place by sanctions. So we now are doing that. We have a baseline, and then after they have the first year of the program where they learn human rights and they learn the health consequences and they've done values deliberation, we find that there is really a huge change in their attitudes and even behavior. How we evaluate behavior is by saying that, would you approve or disapprove of this practice, and would you be willing to intervene, which gets to the more of the behavior aspect of it. And we found in our latest evaluation in 150 communities where we're working in Mali and Guinea-Bissau and Mauritania, that there was a big change after just that first year, and even more so after at the end of the program, when they've gone on to rally other communities and do public declarations together with their extended family. But it's very critical to ask those questions about what others would think of you, and whether they would approve or disapprove, or whether there would be sanctions. And this way, and I could explain more, but we don't have enough time. But I think that this really helped us to better understand what's really going on in the community, whether really there's a change in the social norm or not. Again, if over half still would approve of child marriage, we know that it really hasn't changed. If they believe that others would not. Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Nidal, what's your opinion on this? How are you measuring social norm change within your programs at CARE, within the Tipping Point initiative?
Thanks, Alessandra. If I can maybe speak a little bit beyond Tipping Point, because this is a question that we have been grappling with more broadly across some of our programming, both in Tipping Point, and we have some adolescent, we have some married adolescent programming in Ethiopia. But overall, looking at, how do you measure social norms change? And we've been working with a lot of other peers who are struggling with the same question. And actually recently we put out a paper on the CARE social norms analysis plot framework. It's the SNAP framework. And again, building off of work that others have done. Actually, we've collaborated a lot also with Ben Sizlagi, who used to be with TOSAN, really trying to understand how do we do this. So specific to Tipping Point, I would say, first, I would direct people to check out our SNAP framework as something that looks at these concepts that Molly mentioned, which is, what do I think others are doing? What do I think others expect me to do? What are the sanctions or the anticipated reactions of others whose opinions matter to me? And then also looking at people's sensitivity to the sanctions, how much do the sanctions matter? And then finally, the last part of it is exceptions, which is under what kind of situations is it acceptable to break the norms. So based on this, we've tried a few different things. In our Ethiopia work, we've done some work where we've used vignettes and built surveys off of vignettes to try to understand the norms as a baseline, and then to go back and do that at an end line. With Tipping Point, what we did was in our community participatory analysis, we used participatory tools to look at what people thought others were doing, or what they thought were people's expectations of them, and not only looking at that particular behavior of child marriage, but a little bit more broadly at all these other things that are related to it. So, what do people think if you, if your daughter is going and playing sports, or what do people think if, as a family, you're making decisions about your daughter that don't kind of follow with the conventional norms in that community. So that's what we did in the beginning, and then in our end evaluation for our phase 1, what we did was we used Photo Voice, and we also used SenseMaker, and through those we built in these aspects of the SNAP framework to try to again understand whether or not there was any shifts, or overall is what does the community think people are doing, or what does the community think people expect from them, and what are the reactions. And then lastly, I would say in the innovation briefs that I mentioned, we did do, again, using the SNAP framework, we did these just very initial kind of one-on-one interviews with people who had attended or had exposure to some of our social norms activities, and in those as well tried to understand what the reactions were from a social norms perspective.
Okay, thanks. If that's okay with you, I would like to now give the microphone to Suzanne to kind of highlight her main takeaways from these discussions. Hold on, Suzanne, we are trying to unmute you and not managing. There you go, you're on.
Okay, great, thanks so much. This has been really, really interesting and helpful. Thank you so much to the speakers. So, Alessandra, I think at the beginning of the webinar captured some of the learning from that discussion, and I'm really grateful that Mali and Soraya and Nidal helped to articulate some of how some of this learning has been translated into action on the ground, and what we see from theory really being put into practice. And I'll just note that a lot of the theory came from your programming on the ground, Tostan and Care. So it's kind of a circular thing. We are learning as we go here, and I think being able to capture that learning along the way and sharing it with each other as we're doing on these webinars is incredibly helpful. And I appreciate the transparency and openness of organizations like Tostan and Care sharing what they know, what they don't know, what works, what doesn't work, so that the rest of us can all benefit from that. Some of the points that, excuse me, that I picked up along the way are that Tostan and Care have both started with a good understanding of the local context, understanding where people in the communities learn, from whom do they take their cues, who are the critical reference groups, or that's the term used in the literature and what we've heard from Mali and Nidal. Who are those critical actors and stakeholders who matter, whose opinion makes a difference? And then relying on local leadership and locally led solutions. Recognizing that change can't be imposed from the outside, it has to be driven from within the communities. So to that end, looking for early adopters of change, or as some of us talk about in the literature, the positive deviants, the ones who were doing things differently and in a more positive way, identifying them, giving them space to come together, building solidarity with others, and then equipping them to become champions for social change. So both learning from them and ideally putting them in positions where they can influence others. Working with these local leaders to come up with positive alternatives to harmful practices, and sharing those positive alternatives publicly, and conversely, not to criticize practices or use negative messaging that is something that doesn't work. We heard about using holistic or multi-component or multi-layered programs that target different issues and different stakeholders, community, religious leaders, parents, and so forth, recognizing that child marriage does not occur in a vacuum. It is very much bounded within the realities of the local education system and local employment opportunities for girls, local values. So understanding that you can't just tackle it using one solution, but need to look at different angles and layers. And that to do so and to shift social norms, you don't see change happen overnight. It doesn't happen within a few months. It will take years to shift deeply entrenched norms and values. And so that's something that we all need to keep understanding, that we need to keep articulating to those donors and partners who believe they want to see change and markers of change immediately. What we also discussed last week, but didn't hear as much about on this call until this very last question came in, is how programs that aim to shift social norms measure impact. And I was actually going to ask a couple of questions about this, but someone beat me to it. And I think that shows that there's interest out there in understanding how do you assess the impact of programs that aim to shift social norms. And from the answers from Molly and Nidal and from our discussion last week, I think we have an understanding that we do have some tools and some strategies that are being used, that are being refined, that are being adapted along the way. This is still a relatively new area of work. We know that not only do donors want to see measurable results of programs, but that we want to be able to understand as a community whether what we're doing makes a difference. And so very much appreciate the work that Tostan and CARE are doing along these lines. And also would point you back to what we discussed on last week's call, to learning collaboratives or networks of organizations that are all aiming to put their knowledge together and to learn from each other. Program run by ODI called the Align platform, and then one run by Georgetown Institute of Reproductive Health, the Learning Collaborative. And I believe if you go to the Girls Not Brides website, you can go back to last week's webinars and get links to join those if you're not already members. They have great resources on their websites. Tostan and CARE have a lot of those resources there, and I know are contributing to those learning collaboratives. So thank you for that. And with that, I will just leave it by saying that for us all to continue to learn and grow as a community, and to understand how we can best invest to create effective change, would encourage you all to continue documenting your efforts and sharing your efforts with others, so that we can make a stronger, more effective difference for the issues we care about. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Suzanne. I think I would like to give the microphone to Nidal now, who would like to share another learning collaborative on social norms. Nidal,
Yeah, thanks, Alessandra. And thanks, Suzanne. I just wanted to flag, yes, in addition to the two that Suzanne mentioned, there's another one, which is a collaboration of Strive, which looks at HIV programming in the London School with Laurie Heisey. And that is a learning collaborative on social norms in GBV, but again, tackling very much similar conversations around social norms programming and measurement. So just wanted to flag that collaborative as well.
Thanks, Nidal. Well, you both have done a great job in wrapping this discussion up. So I just wanted to kind of wrap it up on saying that, you know, some of the challenges that have been discussed on this webinar, such as, you know, engaging men and boys, or how to engage religious leaders, how to talk about girls' sexualities, measuring social norms, are all kind of subjects that we are aimed to tackle during our upcoming global meetings. So we hope we'll advance the discussion then as well. Before wrapping up, I just want to highlight that the recording of this webinar will be available online. I know some people have joined quite late, so rest assured you'll be able to access the whole of the recording. And we will also have a summary of discussion which will be uploaded on our on the Girls Up Rights webpage. If you have any other questions which you would like to answer, or you didn't want to answer them now, you can always email them to me privately, and we'll make sure to answer them, each and every one of them. So thank you very much to all for joining, and goodbye.